I want to start first by introducing the panelists. Immediately to my left, we have Kristin. Kristin is an academic from Stanford. Kristin is also a member of the previous Natural Resource Charter Technical Advisory Group and now a member of the Natural Resource Governance Institute Advisory Council. We also have my good friend Rosalind. Rosalind by training is an environmental lawyer. She's also a mining industry practitioner, having worked for DBS and Anglo American, and more recently for Tullow Oil. She is here to speak primarily as the managing director of Kenya Advisory Consultancy. We also have another friend of mine. I have many friends. Michael. Michael is with Local Content Solutions, which is a consulting firm. Michael worked for ODA, and his area of specialty is local content, especially local content policy in the natural resources sector. He published a book. Many of you may already know about this book. And so that constitutes the panel. The focus of today's discussion really is premised on the assumption that there is a traditional or classical model for extracting value, for governments to extract value, but that increasingly there are also alternatives that depart from that assumption. And so the overall object of the panel discussion is to examine first that thesis, two, to also say, assuming that that thesis is valid, what would be the approaches? What do we know about the approaches, and what must we do in order to succeed in fostering those approaches? So without any delay, I'm going to start with Kristin. Kristin is going to give us an academic theoretical perspective, and then we can take it from there. Kristin?
Thank you, Sheila. Good afternoon, everybody. As Sheila pointed out, the objective of my talk is really to set the stage and the context for this panel on non-fiscal benefits. And I'm starting out with a neoclassical economic model, which would suggest a division of labor between the government and companies, whereby it would be the role of the government to make sure that they are maximizing the fiscal benefits that they are getting out of whatever extractive project that they are sanctioning, and maximizing the fiscal revenues on behalf of the citizens, whereas the role of the company would be to focus on the profit maximization role in order to create maximum revenues and fiscal benefits to the government. In that sort of division between company and the government, we would have a company that's, for instance, hiring, making the hiring decision based on the best qualifications that they need for the job at the lowest possible compensation package that they can get hold of to fill these positions. Similarly, for in terms of procurement, they would source their goods and services from whatever company provides them the best deal in terms of quality, quantity, and conditions. And also in terms of investments, they would focus purely on making those infrastructure investments that are immediately relevant for maximizing the profits that they can generate from this extractive project. So that's the company's role under this model. Whereas the government's role would be, as I mentioned, in terms of maximizing the fiscal revenues they're getting from the project, and then use this money to do their job, which is to provide public goods and services. And the benefit of that, from a political perspective, is that having this clear separation would mean that revenues accrue to the government, and so they are subject, the spending decisions are subject to the same oversight and the public accountability mechanisms that the constitution of that country has put in place. So that's the traditional sort of split between the roles. However, we wouldn't be here, I assume, if we believe that that's the end of the story, right? So what we see happening more and more is that is a deviation from the model where we see all sorts of provisions being included that have what we may want to call non-fiscal. I'll take a little shot at the term here at the end. Deviation from this classical model, and there are a couple of reasons why that's happening. And the variety of reasons can be arranged along a spectrum. Some are purely economical, others are purely political, and some are in between the two. So let me maybe start with the ones down on the economic spectrum, purely economic. So one I want to mention has to do with information asymmetries and the cost of acquiring information. So for the neoclassical economic model to work, we're making the assumption that all actors make the decisions under being fully informed. In reality, we know that's not the case, right? For two principal reasons. One is it's costly to obtain information. Even when it's in the public domain, you still need to make an effort to collect the data, to analyze it, and so on. So that can be a deterrent because of the transaction cost. The other reason for how information can be a problem has to do with the proprietary nature of certain information. So it's not even possible to get hold of the data, even if you make the time and even financial commitment to trying to get hold of it. And that's why we see certain governmental interventions to work around this informational problem. For instance, in terms of addressing the cost element, we see under why that can be an obstacle. We see a number of countries, and maybe Michael will be speaking more on that side, where, for instance, governments are setting up supplier registries to make it easier for oil, gas, and mining companies to see who the local suppliers are that they could be tapping into. So instead of them having to do basic field research to find out who could be serving our cleaning needs out in the field or who could be catering to our project and so on, they can just go online, find it easy through a registry where they can just search by function and by qualification and by whatever quality standards they meet to bring down that sort of transaction cost. The other element of information that's being tackled through some other type of governmental intervention has to do with the proprietary nature, where we see a number of countries now imposing a requirement on oil and gas and mining companies to publicly share their procurement plan, so that the local suppliers can better plan around that. Then we also have time inconsistencies and externality benefits from local hiring. So it may, maybe it's not in the best interest of the company itself in the short term to hire locals, but long term there will be economic benefits coming out of that. But since time is short, I want to move on straight away to the political aspects, where we see another reason, a fundamentally different reason why we could possibly see an inclusion of non-fiscal elements into contracts, which has to do with the fact that in certain countries, the official institutions that have been created to provide these certain public goods, like the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education and so on, may be incompetent, or they may not be politically aligned with the leadership, they may be totally corrupt, and the leadership may find it easier just to walk around these ministries than tackle them and reform them hands-on. And the way of working around them is to have the companies do the job that actually should be done by the Ministry of Health and Education and so on. I'm mentioning mentioning Saudi Arabia, where we see Saudi Aramco, the oil company, taking on a lot of infrastructure projects and also education and so on, that should, in other countries come out of the Ministry of Education and so on, not from an oil company. So having laid that out, I just want to conclude that that for both these political and economic reasons, it can make sense to include these non-fiscal elements. And why I have the problem with the term non-fiscal is actually because in many of these cases, the benefits are still fiscal, but we actually see a shifting from the fiscal not maybe we're not maximizing the fiscal we're getting out of the oil contract or the gas and mining contract in the short term, but we see the fiscal benefits occurring in another sector, say as income tax from the local suppliers who now get better deals by supplying these oil and gas and mining companies. So maybe we just see the fiscal occurring in some other sector, or we see the fiscal occurring at some other time. So if we make an investment in and have oil and gas and mining companies do investment in R&D and in local training of the workforce and of suppliers, we may see a diminution of the revenues and the fiscal benefits we are achieving today, but as a benefit we see a greater uptake of revenues and fiscal benefits occurring in the future that are outside of the immediate contract itself. So I think I just want to leave it here, and with the concluding note that whenever we're talking about looking into the option of doing this non-fiscal, we have to keep in mind that it increases the complexity of the deal significantly, which means that we need to be even more conscientious about setting up the right oversight and public accountability mechanisms, because we are stepping outside of the traditional framework of public oversight through budgeting and so on. So making the deals more complex increases the necessity for public oversight and accountability even more than under the traditional model.
Thank you very much, Christine. I guess on listening to Christine, several things naturally come to mind, but one of which is the question of how sustainable it is. If we depart from the classical model of receive rents, use it to deliver public services and separate the role of the state from that of the body corporate. If we then move from that, how do we ensure that whatever receipts, whether they're in the form of infrastructure, whether they are in the form of other social services, how do the governments that receive this build the capacity to ensure that when the company or the extraction is no longer occurring, that they can then maintain that? I want to pack that question because I think in the end, whatever we receive, there must be some assumption that to Paul's point of investing in investment, that somehow you transfer this asset into another form of asset that can be replicated. But I now want to move to Rosalind. Rosalind is going to give us a perspective of the private sector. Rosalind, based on her experience, is going to try and help us understand essentially what the benefits might be, not so much to the government, but to the private sector. Why would it be in the interest of the private sector to adopt this approach? What might be the opportunity cost of the private sector of not embracing this new dispensation? So, Rosalind, I'll come to you now.
Can you hear me? I think Sheila has framed the question quite well, because when I think about non-fiscal benefits, I'm thinking in terms of a company having to contribute to broader socio-economic development of a country. Because I think that the normal fiscal benefits, as Christine has said, are the taxes, the royalties, and those sort of things that normally just come out of you're doing business and the government therefore taxes you and asks you to pay whatever royalties and taxes there should be. So for me, after experiencing the three companies that Sheila has mentioned, I've come to recognize that if companies don't contribute to broader socio-economic development, but are contributing to a general growth in a country, no matter how shallow or deep it is, so long as that growth is not broad or inclusive enough, it can lead to societal disparities, which in themselves can cause conflicts and tensions, which are then a cost to the company. And there have been many examples. There's an example of a company where even one day of a rig not operating can cost the company $500,000. So you can imagine if there's a week of tension where your rigs cannot operate, that's quite a few $1 million being lost. There's been some recent study done to show that for mining projects valued between 3 and 5 billion, there can be cost of 20 million a week as a result of societal conflicts. So I think it's very important, therefore, in the enlightened self-interest of companies themselves, to be able to look at what areas can they contribute to. And interestingly, I had lunch recently with Aidan Healy, who's CEO of Tullow, a company that I worked for recently, and my recent boss, and we were talking about Ghana and Ghana's current fiscal issues. And he said, you know, one of the things that concerns him is that we don't just have assets in the country, we also have responsibilities. And I think that is the approach now of a lot of responsible CEOs and leaders of corporates. It's not just a question of we've got the assets, so let's explore, exploit, or produce them, but what are the other responsibilities that we have in the countries? And so for me, I think the reasons why companies do contribute or should contribute is because it helps create an environment that is conducive to the long-term sustainability of their businesses, critical for the extractive industry, which needs a 10, 20, 30, 40-year time frame in which to be successful. And this in turn creates value for shareholders who cannot be ignored and other stakeholders. The vast majority of shareholders in a company are investing because they believe that the core business will provide them with a decent return. Now, Africa is the area that I know best, and I have to say now that as an extractive company in Africa, you will not be able to provide the decent returns your shareholders need unless you take into account the broader socio-economic challenges of the country and how best to contribute to them. For me, the contribution should be decided through proper negotiations with government. And I would dare to say that they should be part of your negotiations for your licenses, for your petroleum agreements, for your petroleum sharing agreements, rather than what I now call the CSR sideshow, which is something that is done after the event. So you've dealt with your agreements, you've got all that, and then all of a sudden there's talk about what is your local content targets, or are you going to contribute to health issues or education or the rest. But to really sit with government and really properly negotiate what are the contributions, non-fiscal, socio-economic, that as a company going to make, have it tied into the agreement. I'm not saying that that will mean that the agreements will never be changed, but at least there's a clear framework and boundaries in which you're working. The next question that I want to address is what sort of contribution should companies make? And I think it's very important to say that I purposely use the word contribution because companies should not take over the rules of government. And Sheila, this is to your point. And I think it's something that we are all still debating and wondering how best to tread that fine line. I think that's why it's also very important to have those negotiations as part of the licensing agreements, so the boundaries are clearly set, the role of government clearly set, the role of companies clearly set within that. So for example, in a fiscal crisis, if a country is going through a fiscal crisis, how best or should the company somehow step in to help? I mean, and this can cause all sorts of conflict of interest, but if you don't, somewhere down the line, you'll be seen as the deepest pocket in town, and therefore you'll be taxed. So these things do need to be thought about and discussed up front. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that the largest direct contribution that companies do make are through royalties, taxes, payments to employees and suppliers. And I think for this reason, it's also important to think of a way that companies might be able to find an appropriate space to participate in discussions on revenue management, how these revenues will be used. And I know there's always this question of, it's not a company's business to talk about these issues or to get involved in these discussions. But I was quite pleased to hear that the Charter, for example, could create the space or be a tool to create the sort of right environment for these discussions to take place and for companies to really be able to contribute in helping with effective revenue management. The other contributions are job creation and local content, but I'll leave that for Michael to deal with. And some of the non-fiscal benefits or contributions that companies can make, I think, is to help the country attract additional investors, not just in the extractive, but in other sectors. And the reason why it's useful for extractive industry companies to do so is that it then takes away the burden of you being the only show in town. And international companies, particularly, and I can speak about Tullow because I was there, have looked to doing that, where you can even organize an investor forum. It will be sometimes better better organized than if the government's organized itself, and attract the right sort of people. And because you're an investor in the country, it is likely that people will come and hear really what your experiences are, what the difficulties are. I think another area is leveraging exploration activities to contribute to knowledge and understanding of national biodiversity and cultural heritage. I think again, particularly in countries where this is important for tourism and other such areas, the exploration teams are very good at this. You know, if they go into these sensitive areas, they can help in making sure that data on biodiversity that's there, data on cultural heritage that's available, can properly be harnessed and then protected. Again, I think Christine has mentioned it, contributing to major infrastructure projects. But these should be linked to the business. So if it's roads that are being built, for example, could it be used to help with greater market access or to help with other sectors? I'm not a fan of building hospitals or schools just for the sake of building hospitals or schools. But if sometimes extractive industries are in very remote areas, they actually might need the schools for their own, or hospitals for their own use. So I think it's a very important thing to say, okay, are we building a hospital that we can use for the business because the business needs it? And then we make that available also to the company. So you're not having this CSR, okay, thank you, Sheila. You're not having the CSR happening where there are then no doctors, no nurses, no hospital beds, no medicine. And you've cut the ribbon, taken a nice photo, and that's it. So I think what's important is to make sure that all these contributions are clearly linked to the business. In terms of negotiating, someone said earlier that I think RIO is helping with national development planning in Guinea, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? And I think that's a really good start because you're starting early, understanding what the national development plans are if they're there, and if not, somehow contributing in some way to developing them as they impact your business. And after that's been done, to decide which aspects of the national development plans it makes sense for you as a mining company, as an oil and gas company to contribute to. You're not going to be all things to all people, but there may be aspects of it that it makes sense for your business to contribute to over and above just your core business. Sheila, I think we need to leave it there because we can talk about cost and transfer.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and I enjoyed listening to your perspective. I am particularly, I think there's something worth looking at, especially the question of whether private companies, having contributed to the national coffers and a voice in how that expenditure is invested. I think this is a very important question. Because if you think about it, when there's a fallout, we look to the investor. Yet, when they put the money in the kitty, they're expected to walk away and have no say. I think this is something that is worth looking at and saying, you know, can we just draw this line in the sand? Or can we, in effect, say, you now are also a legitimate citizen of the state. You now have a voice. When I worked for the private sector, I insisted that we should have a voice and that we shouldn't be timid. And that to the extent that we knew we had done the right thing, we, like any other member of the public, should have a right in demanding responsible behavior out of the government. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me turn to Michael. Michael is a local content specialist, and I don't use that word specialist, lightly. Michael knows quite a lot, and so we invited him to give us a perspective on quite how to construct this local content policy approach. How do we analyze the potential for the local market to sustain local content? So, Michael, I'll come to you now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. 10 minutes, yeah?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so maximising the non-fiscal benefits of resource extraction. It's really, I'm going to speak just to local content. It would fit with the Charter precept number 10, private sector development. And I wanted to put on the table 5 key success factors for leveraging what the Charter calls, or what this conference is calling, non-fiscal benefits. And I'm just going to interpret that predominantly as local content. Now, I always advise people before ever there's a second sentence after the word local content to say exactly what you mean. So I'm going to do the 10-second version of what I mean when I say local content. So I'm going to talk about local content meaning national content, not just the economic opportunities around the geographic mine or onshore oil operations. So this is about the national industrial base of the country. It's about workforce, nationals in the workforce, both in the operating company and in the supply chain. It's about goods and services that are either, there's various definitions, bought from local companies. You have to then define what you mean by a local company. Or it could be the value added to the economy from all of that expenditure. Then there's a capacity building component. That's how operators and big suppliers work with national institutions, build fixed assets, build infrastructure. There's quite a landscape that is local/national content. The other point I want to make is that the only reason I can make a living out of this is that it's a compliance regime. It's no longer just a nice to have, it is a compliance regime, and it's probably about 15 years, 20 years behind the health and safety curve. So if any of you are thinking that this is just about a company with a benevolent act, it's not. There are, as you all are aware, Ghana now has its primary legislation dedicated to local/national content, as does Nigeria, as does Brazil, as does Kazakhstan, as does Indonesia, as will soon Tanzania, as will soon Mozambique, and on and on and on. It's a compliance regime, which is why we train in my company about, we've now trained I think 300 professionals. Half of them have a title that includes the word local content. Yet there isn't a single management course that I'm aware of that actually has a single module on local content. So the regulations and the compliance regime are far ahead of where the rest of the education system is. Now, so these 5 key principles. 1, balance local content policy with commercial realities. Who has the best, which country has the best local content regulations in the world? Shout it out, go on, someone. Brazil?
Nigeria.
Trinidad? Nigeria? It's not like that, is it? It's not a linear graph. It's the regulations and the policy needs to be fit for purpose. So Oman has a very different policy objective to Tanzania. So Tanzania has just put its draft policy out on the table, some of you may have seen it. So that's the first key principle. If you are a frontier country like Tanzania or Mozambique and you are trying to prove your industry, you would not be sensible if you put in place draconian primary legislation with targets in that primary legislation that were in excess of what the local market could deliver. Because you're going to have schedule delays and cost overruns, and it's going to become a bureaucratic nightmare. So you're not going to prove your industry, which is one reason why Ghana, whether by default or intentionally, did not have a strong local content policy on the table when the Jubilee field was developed. And hey-ho, they delivered it on time and on budget. They proved the industry, and now they can push harder on local content. The detail of whether they should have pushed a little bit harder, I think we can leave for discussion. So fit your policy to the state of your market. Nigeria has a long history of oil and gas. So does Angola. They can have those regulations. But if Sierra Leone pushes too hard, or Tanzania pushes too hard, then Mozambique's going to get gas to market first. Okay. Second, engineer smart regulations, not blunt instruments. Okay? So think through, if you're going to set targets as a regulator, whether the market can actually deliver those targets. If you're going to stretch the number of nationals in the workforce or the volume of spend with local suppliers, then stretch where there is a potential for it to stretch. Don't start putting targets down for fabrication if you don't have fabrication yards that can handle that capacity. And the timeline of the next project is not sufficient for you to build that capacity. So be smart in the regulations you design. Third, know what can, cannot, and could be done in the local market. I think this one, as my understanding of this subject matures, this one is so important. We work now with a couple of majors, and they are 2.5, 3 years away from the final investment decision. This is oil and gas I'm talking about. And we have already forecast what we think the local content is going to look like for that major project going forward. We've come up with an entire breakdown of the scope, we've costed it out, and we've gone to the market, and we're trying to work out what can be done if it went ahead now, what could be done, given that we've got 2.5 years, and what cannot be done, even with 2.5 years of lead time. So as you go from a first phase project to a second to a third, you hope that more can be done, and some of those areas that you develop that could, it's traffic light, yes, so green can, Amber could, red can't. And you hope that more of the coulds turn into green. It's very important to do that and to carry that forecast through as a template that matures in its detail and quality. So as you go into front-end engineering design, and then you go to detailed design, and you go into scopes of work for major EPC contracts, take the same forecasts, evolve them so they get more granular, more detailed, more accurate, and then you'll have clear line of sight so that you really can set targets that have sanctions behind them and that are likely to be delivered. If you do what you've done in Brazil and you set your targets at the time of signing concession, you really have an open hell of knowing whether those targets are going to be hit or not, because you don't even know what's under the ground yet. So set your targets, if you're going to do that, and your preferences at a time when you have clear line of sight of what really is possible. I'm nearly there, Sheila. Fourth one, utilise contract tendering to incentivise local content. This is what my company does. Ah, there you go. I hope you could hear. I don't know if you heard the first third of it. Utilise contract tendering to incentivise local content. It's what my company specialises in. So I can't really say too much about it, but we've just come out of a major tender process. This is a billions and billions of dollars single contract. And there were offers of local content in that bid. And for about the last year and a half, we've been laying out how we would incentivize the bid, how we will evaluate it, how we'll integrate the scores into contract award. And it's quite exciting what may happen depending on who wins. So that point of leverage with 90% of CapEx spend going out through 8 contracts. If you're ever looking for a magic bullet, that's the magic bullet. That's your maximum point of leverage. Once you've issued the lump sum contract, you better have locked in what your expectations are on local content, because it'll be too late after they are up and running. And then finally, align local content metrics with the policy direction, which takes us back to the beginning. Don't ever underestimate the impact that the metric, the indicator has that you set for reporting local content, because it will drive behavior. If you say you want companies to report how much they spend with an indigenously owned company, and you define that as 51% indigenous ownership, and you set targets for that, then that's what you'll get. You'll get people delivering those targets, or as best as they can, if there are strong sanctions behind that. If you suddenly wake up as a regulator and say, well, actually, that wasn't really what we wanted. We wanted jobs, and we wanted capacity, so we needed the internationals. So actually what we should have done is set a metric that said, how much are we spending on companies that are registered in country, with facilities in country, employing more than 80% nationals. So the metric drives behavior, and the metric has to be lined up with the policy direction. So in summary, 5 key success factors for optimizing local content, not maximizing. 1, balance local content policy with commercial realities. 2, engineer smart regulations, not blunt instruments. 3, know what can, could, and cannot be done in the local market. 4, utilize contract tendering to incentivize local content. And 5, align local content metrics with policy direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm struck by not just what you say, but also what you don't say. Of course, there are commercial realities, but also there are political imperatives, which, as it happens, is why we are seeing these legislations. And for what it's worth, I think the elephant in the room really about local content is whether or not it is a natural resource issue, or whether, for that matter, it is an industrial policy issue. Because what you are talking about really is the country's capacity to deliver goods and services competitively, which is why you quite rightly recognize that there is a tipping point at which if a country pushes far enough, they cease to be competitive, and then the investment capital goes elsewhere. And so I think as we ponder this is one of the things that we can consider. But what you certainly write about is to remind us that there is a drive towards legislating rather than incentivizing. The real question is whether or not legislation alone is adequate to make local content successful, or whether instead the market forces will, in the end, notwithstanding how many of the 54 African countries have these legislations, that in effect these legislations will just come to pass. because in the end, the investor will make a decision? I think this is an important question. But I do wish to thank the panel for very insightful comments. I'm not going to try and summarize and insult your right of intelligence, but I am going to just say a few things that I think are pertinent, that we spoke about, but that they didn't have a chance to talk about. I mean, the notion of how do you leverage non-fiscal to get a better deal. Actually, to me, it's not is the bottom end of that question that is important, which is what is a good deal? And I think that is the key. It's good because it has development context. It is good because it has economic context. And that itself is very unique to every country. Therefore, I don't want to get involved with a generic good deal because it does not exist. A good deal for the people of Botswana is that deal that takes them from the position where they are today to a better place. And so I think when we think of fiscal or non-fiscal regime, it's a question of what in the end, what is the problem developmentally that we are trying to fix? I think the question of what non-fiscal benefits should a country target, again, is a moot question. What non-fiscal targets does a country need? I think it's a better answer. I think the question of the issue that Rosalind raised of the value of working with companies, especially to increase knowledge. One of the things that one rarely ever hears is a reference to that actually the oil and mining and gas companies are hugely involved in R&D. And with this, they need essentially theoretical grounded science or economics on which they then apply solutions to the operations. This to me seems to me one of the areas where in countries where education is underfunded, where R&D is very costly, and that governments cannot afford, it seems to me a logical place for them to say, you know, for us, we need capacities of our education institutions. And because we know that you do research to solve problems for your own operations, this is an area we wish to. And so again, from both the Natural Resource Charter and the audience, this I think is a space about which very little is said. Should Rio be involved in the planning of development of Guinea? Well, if you ask me, I'd say no. You know why? You just don't want to take on too much. Let countries learn. I think when a company starts to be involved in the development planning, I'm not so sure that's right. Certainly, they can support the plan, but the plan must be owned by the people of that country. This would be mine, but you know, the world's not perfect. So I accommodate you. So I'm going to come to you now, since I've had my penny's worth. If there are any questions and comments that you would like to raise for the audience, please do. We have a roving mic. Where is our mic man? Okay, there's our mic man.
Thank you very much.
I didn't point you out. I'm the chair. I'm still alive, you know. No, but it's okay. You go ahead. But just remember, I didn't call on you.
Thank you all the same. Yes. I think this is an extremely important subject because natural resource extraction and management by every means are supposed to contribute to the national development agenda. And I'm glad that it was raised that natural resources are a contributing factor to improving life and conditions and the development framework that has been set by government. Fortunately, most countries, I mean, like Sierra Leone now, we have a long-term development plan. They call it Agenda for Prosperity. And it will be useful to see how that development plan takes on board the natural resource as the means by which to finance or to facilitate that plan. And it is within that context that I think that the whole concept of local content needs to be taken into account, because local content is not something that comes by chance. It takes into account the long-term development agenda and what contribution the sector can make to that development agenda. And the local content is developed to facilitate that process. So to me, it looks like the local content is a framework that steers how much contribution can be made by which. And it needs to be, and I don't really quite, I don't know to what extent it can be linked to market realities, because market realities change so fast, and you have a long-term development agenda, and then you don't want to plan long-term with the local content, what kind of local content. I think it begs the issue of then not really meeting your development needs. I don't know whether that is what you intend to say, but I think that local content must be linked to the long-term development plan and to see how it works along that. It's an aspirational plan, like aspirational process. That's why it needs to be more legislated than of any activity plan that deals with issues at stake. And I also think that the whole question, Rosalind raised the issue of contributing, following the money. I think it's a means of, like the development aid that happens, they send money to Africa and they send consultants there and they do everything and they want to see what happens to that money. I think it does not help the government and the local actors to take control and to own their process and to manage and even learn from their mistakes. I think it becomes too much because there's already the power equation at play, and the companies are already more powerful, and to begin to control the money and know what happens to the money is actually making people, the government, look small, and the people not contribute to their own development in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some, yes, please, we have a mic. And then I'm going to give the Global Witness gentleman, and then I'm going to give the gentleman from Sudan, and then we're going to answer.
Yeah, two comments. I think one of the issues that companies struggle with and that countries struggle with is very often there is a global development vision for a country, and it has a number of different titles, but very often the mining policy is a standalone, very much a sectoral policy. I mean, I remember when I was asked to review the National Development Plan as part of a project, we looked at the National Development Plan in South Africa. There was only once in that document mining was mentioned. While it's obviously a very significant source of revenues for the country. And therefore, even if you have a strategy that says this is where the country wants to be in 30 years, if the role of the extractive industry isn't recognized and acknowledged in terms of revenues, in terms of jobs, in terms of infrastructure, it's very hard for the various actors, including the sectoral ministries, to actually define what the right strategies are and the expectations and so on. That was my first comment. And I think this is one of the challenges that the AMDC in Addis is trying to address by trying to see how the AMV can be then translated into national policies. The second challenge from having worked for a mining company for a number of years, and at AGA we were trying to support the formulation of local development plans. And to your point, Sheila, we were doing it through a third party because we felt that if we had been involved too much, then the end result would have not been accepted by the Guinean governments and the Guinean stakeholders, and we had another pilot in Tanzania. I think more and more mining companies or extractive companies are if they have that option, they are willing to actually work through partnerships, because most of these companies recognize that local development and a number of other issues are actually not their core functions, and very often they're not equipped to deliver on these targets in a significant manner. I think the challenge is, and I was in Mozambique last week with, on a mission with donors, and we met with mining companies and so on, is that very often those 3 or 4 categories of stakeholders have a very hard time talking to each other and understanding what they can do for each other. So, and I think that's one of the, the partnership challenges, certainly full of promises, but a hard one to deliver on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Gavin Hayman from Global Witness in London. It was a question on local content. It's often abused by elites who perhaps take advantage of it to strike sweetheart deals between themselves and particularly extractive companies. And so I wondered what the safeguards would be in local content policies to prevent that kind of thing. And a question, if I may, to Rosalind, which is, I've always suspected that CSR was a sideshow. It was very interesting to hear her say that. Would you say that's broadly the feeling of lots of progressive people within business now, that it's something of a sideshow, or indeed, it is dead?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I would start with the good deal. The three presenters have presented a very comprehensive and a good presentation. Unfortunately, all the three presentations were all one-sided, and that is they concentrated on the benefits the people should get, but they forgot one thing. What are the social costs attached to this particular benefit? And this is very important, because if you don't analyze the social cost part, then all those benefits could be misleading in one form or another. And I have to give a typical example. Environment assessment has not been mentioned here. And the present situation we have in Nigeria, in the Delta region, which now had been converted to Boko Haram, it didn't start as a Boko Haram. It started on the fact that the environment in the 50s, when oil was discovered in Nigeria, never existed. So they just came in and displaced the local population. Same thing happened in South Sudan. When Chevron came in the 70s, they just went in, no feasibility study, no environmental assessment, and now the areas the oil had been discovered in South Sudan are a disaster. There's nothing you can do about them. They really been totally destroyed, and you cannot even think of development because the area is totally damaged. And now the war we have in South Sudan, people may think is a tribal war, is a political war. It has nothing to do with that, exactly like the Delta region in Nigeria. They have been devastated, and no community fund for compensation that have been provided. And the companies that come in, they have their own interests. Second thing which I want to mention is, which the panel did not even talk about, who owns these natural resources? Is it the government? Is it the local population? And how can you address that? Because it looks like you're addressing the issue as if the local population are the end user or the end benefit. But can we say that it is they who are the owner? Ownership matters a lot in such a situation. Technological transfer, we have an issue with that. For example, if you take the Chinese, the way the Chinese operate, is very complicated. They are resolving their unemployment issue in their country through other countries. That's why they come with a very large number of workers, to a certain country, whether they are doing a railway or a road or worst, oil. See, they only take, if you can know how to clean a rig, that's a big technological transfer to local people. Otherwise, the majority of them are being kept as bodyguards or whatever, cleaners, and there's no way in 15, 20 years that the technology of oil and mining can be transferred from the Chinese to local people. So this is another critical issue which created a problem.
Please, excuse me, you've asked 3 questions. Is it all right if I give them a chance to answer?
Oh, okay, that's fine.
They will forget all the questions you've asked.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay,
So I want to end up telling my sister from the African Development Bank, I'm from South Sudan.
Tell me at dinner.
I'm South Sudan. I'm not from Sudan. Thank you.
Yes, I apologize. I think in the interest of setting the record straight. Actually, the panel had a specific mandate, and they spoke to that. And that's not to say the environment is not important, but that was not within the frame of what they were requested to speak about. I do have to say that you are not correct in saying that they didn't reference ownership. That's why she's speaking of rent, because we recognize that the state is the landlord, which de facto means they own the asset. So they might not necessarily have said it outright, but the entire conversation here is premised on the assumption that you have a landlord and that the tenant has certain obligations. So I do have to say that you are not correct. But that's that. I'll let the panel answer. We had a question, how do we link local content to market reality? I think perhaps I paraphrased the gentleman from Sierra Leone because he spoke a little long.
Right, is this on? I'll try and answer. Tangentially, I wrote down something about long-term. Okay, there's been a gentleman up here. Yeah, long-term development. Just quick answers. On that one, where would it be helpful to focus if you were looking for longer-term capacity building and longer-term opportunities for more nationals to be employed and more products and services to be produced and supplied locally? Unless you have rolling capital projects, which is very rare, Mozambique will probably have that, maybe Tanzania, Ghana has not got it, you're better off focusing on the operational spend. And mining sector, of course, lends itself to that because a lot of they have actually rolling capital expenditure. So have to replace some of that big earth-moving equipment from time to time, as well as the normal operational spend. Now that, you should get good line of sight of how much and what specifications you need and how often the capital equipment needs to be replaced. So when you have that line of sight, mining companies can start talking to each other like they do in Ghana. They can look for where they can pool their expenditure, and then you put that out there into the market, and the market can react and raise money and invest to deliver some of that, those services and goods. So I would focus for long-term development on the operational spend in the mining sector, and in oil and gas, yes, if that's possible, but sometimes there's rolling projects which offer that same sort of opportunity as well.
Thank you. Would you like to speak about the question of costs, but also the safeguards?
Yes, so there were some people voiced their critical comments with regard to the non-fiscal benefits and local content, and I think it's very important, and maybe in our initial statements we didn't put enough emphasis on the risks and dangers associated with putting a big emphasis on local content, non-fiscal policies. And here I want to highlight what Kevin also mentioned about corruption. I mean, depending on what metric you use, it's very easy for political elites to capture those. I mean, I'm thinking of suppliers, right, local procurement, and that's where Michael's point about how metrics drive behavior is so very true. If you simply have a metric stipulating that a certain percentage of your goods and services procured has to come from local firms, and local means ownership, then it's very easy that you just have a local middleman with a fax machine and a smartphone getting the contract from oil and gas company X and out for whatever mileage of pipelines, and simply outsourcing that straight away as soon as a contract comes in, with the only job being created is that of that one middleman who's cashing in on the contract as a commission. So that's obviously not what the government had intended, and that's where the metrics really do come in. That's like one element of the of the costs associated with local content. We see other perverse effects happening in terms of hiring. For instance, we have a lot of accounts of locals being hired simply to stay home because it's cheaper to have them, pay them to stay, not to interfere with the operations, instead of training them and making them productive members. Again, that's a totally perverse incentive and undermines whatever the government had in mind in terms of training workforce, increasing the work ethics and so on. So that's like another element of the cost side. Then purely economic costs are, of course, that if you don't have a proper alignment between the goals that you stipulate and the market realities, you see cost overruns, you see delays, you see investments that are being deterred or delayed. And even ultimate recovery rates can be negatively affected if there's a mismatch between the stipulated goal and the realities.
Thank you. Rosalind, you're welcome to respond or add to any one of those, but there was a specific question asked of you, of whether or not you perceive the trend towards recognizing PR as inherently lightweight and calling for something much more substantive is one that is prevalent, or that it is still a novice.
I'd want to say just something very quickly about local content. It was interesting that the topic is maximizing the non-fiscal benefits from resource extraction. And I think, for me, I find that one group of people that's missing from all this is actually the citizens of the country who should be taking advantage of the local content opportunities. I just had I'm from Ghana, but I live here, I'm from Ghana. I had a 10-day trip to Ghana, and I was very interested to meet people who were not politically linked, but who are what I call my classmates. I grew up in Ghana, went to school there, who are now middle class and doing well. And they said to me, there was a group of them, that all they wanted was for an international company to come and make them their representative and pay them a commission, to your point. And these are well-educated, intelligent people who have had the experience I've had. And I was challenging them that it is your job to also train yourselves to be able to take full advantage of what is happening. Because if, for example, for some reason the oil industry was to close down, or you pause it, but you'd be left with your commission, which you most probably would have spent, and nothing more. You cannot in any way transfer or translate some knowledge or technology that you'd have acquired through that time to another country even. So I think one of the things that always is missing from the discussion, there's a talk about what governments should do, there's a talk about what companies should do, but I think there's also a need to talk to citizens themselves who are informed and educated about what their responsibility is to acquire the sort of capability, knowledge that's necessary to be able to take advantage. To the point about CSR, I don't like the term CSR, not because I don't believe there is some good in it, but my view now, unfortunately, I now work for no company but my own, so I can share my view, is that if you want to be kind as a company, set up a foundation, give it money, and let it go and do great philanthropic things. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it is very clear then that that's what it's doing. But as to part of your business where you are having that, make sure that whatever you're doing is linked to the business. It's the only way it will be sustainable. Otherwise, I was head of external affairs for Tullow. I might have had a pet subject, pet topic, did it. There's now a new person in Bepe. She might come and say, well, I don't like this, I'm doing something else, and it goes away. If you do what is called CSR, and I call it social investment now, that is linked. For example, we talk about education, Sheila. I think a very good point here. And you go into a country and you say, well, it's a new oil province, a new mining province. We need people to be employed by the company. We see that there's not the capability in country yet. What we're going to do is to, one, invest in educating people, but most probably invest in building up facilities in country that can educate people for the industry. You can start from secondary school. You can start with sciences and work your way through the system. But for me, that is sustainable. And for me, that is not philanthropy in that sense, because you are linking it to your business and it will last. It's very difficult for someone else to come and say, well, why is the company doing that? As I said, if it's a hospital, make sure that it's linked to your business, because you then populate it with all that's needed. So when I talk about a sideshow here, I'm not dissing CSR as is done in its various forms, but I'm concerned about the sustainability of it. And Sheila, I think you used the right word. I don't like it as PR. It really gets on my nerves. This is about real people who need something that is lasting. And when companies do it just because they say it's PR and it doesn't last, it helps nobody, it doesn't help them, it doesn't help the people. So That's what I mean by that. Sheila, I just want to answer a point you made about
Yes.
the national development plans. I think for me it's a question. I also have to face the reality of a lot of countries have great plans. And the question is, how do companies then go in and say which part of those plans, again in the same narrative, which part of those plans can we support and participate in linked to our businesses? If the country doesn't have a plan or there's no local plan, I think to Laurent's point again, how do companies support the development of plans, whether directly, maybe not, I agree it's not sensible, or indirectly. But I think we have to face the reality that so long as you are an international extractive company, as we said, there are certain expectations, and it's how you manage the meeting of those expectations that's important. And it is a case for debate and discussion, and I think that's where the Charter, for example, being implemented practically can come in and sort of help answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Rosen. I must ask Jan David, do we have more time for questions?
I think we can take a few questions, yes.
Okay, then we'll...
You want me to answer the one about corruption?
Yes, yeah, okay.
So the gentleman was asking about elites and local content. Can you put your hand up? I can't remember who it was.
Yes.
Someone. Yes. Okay. I think two of the answers are two of the regulations which put at risk that issue. One is restricted tender lists. So where you have where the requirement is that for this list of products or services, thou shalt procure from a list of nationally owned companies or some other definition of local companies. That's a recipe for passing it to your favoured few. The other one is where in the regulation you have discretion at high level. That can be discretion in right of veto on a tender board for the national partner, for the government party, whether that's through the national oil company or a ministry. So for big contract tenders, you can find that there's criteria to evaluate, and then there's the discussion that happens about now who should we really award it to. And that discretion can sometimes be underpinned by regulation. So one has to be very cautious about, sometimes you need, if you've set your targets too high for the local market to deliver, then you need discretion for common sense to prevail. But now you've introduced discretion, so now you've introduced the risk of the contracts going in the wrong direction. So I think those are the two that I would put in place. I mean, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has had quite a major impact, and corporations and the big international suppliers and the major engineering companies are incredibly conscious of that. And their staff would very rarely be the ones engaged in those sort of practices. A little bit down the chain, it gets a bit more risky.
Thank you. I mean, I think whether one is dealing with, the receiver of revenue pocketing tax receipts, or a minister giving a supply license to his wife, the key issue here is not really the natural resources transparency and accountability. I think it's important that we know what the issue is, and because then that instructs us on how to deal with it. But I also think, Michael spoke earlier about defining both the locality, but also defining what constitutes a local or a citizen-owned company. It turns out that all of these things, sadly, they solve a certain problem, but they surface another complexity. And I think this is why we have to have this debate, and I think this is why the Natural Resource Charter, among others, might help. The example that Rosalind gives of young people who think that if you are appointed by a foreign company, you just get commission, then this is tragic. But of course, that is what the government of Ghana is driving, saying educate them. But what the government stops short of doing is educating them in terms of the ethics of why we drive local content. And if we keep insisting that local companies must get an opportunity, that people like me must get an opportunity of education, but stop short of making them understand why this is done from a national development point of view, then of course they think it's a personal benefit. They don't realize that with privilege comes the responsibility to then give those that gave you that opportunity a return on this investment. And to me, I think part of why legislation is somewhat flawed is that around legislation you can't have ethics, if you see what I mean. You know, legislation per se imports ethics, but how do you build this conversation of you now have an opportunity, you are now a national vehicle for driving development, not driving personal gain. So my sister there in green, you wanted to ask a question? I'll start with you. Or it's been answered now? No, you don't have to if you are done. So we'll come to you, Catherine, and then the lady behind Catherine. We have two ladies there, and then the gentleman. Okay, so two gentlemen there, another one here, 5, and then we will, I think David will insist we wrap up. Okay, then we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. My name's Catherine McPhail. I'm with BG East Africa. I have a question around the local content, and we've had a very interesting commentary around capacity building, training, contracting strategies. The piece that I hear, that I don't hear rather, is around the business environment. So many companies will want to procure goods and services from in-country sources. But if companies or people who've been trained up find it very difficult to register a business, get contracting, construction permits, you know, the World Bank has got a very good index called the Ease of Doing Business. And how about helping countries to drive their ranking up that ease of doing business, which in turn can send a powerful message to other investors to go and invest in that country? That's my first comment. The second is in terms of maximizing the benefits. But we've heard a little bit about industrial policy, but what I find with many local content policies is that they're actually confined to the oil and gas sector. They're not national local content policies, so missing opportunities around the whole downstream, because direct opportunities often within oil and gas are not that big, but there's huge potential around that broader industrialization. So again, if we're looking to maximize, what about really a truly national local content policy? Thank you.
We have some, yes, please, yeah, you go ahead. Oh, that lady.
Yeah, I mean, it's not
No, it's fine, we'll come to her. And then the lady with the navy top. Yeah, you'll point us.
Okay, Philippe Le Billon from the University of British Columbia. I just wanted to open up a little bit the discussion, because it seems most of you are really focusing on local content for industrial extractive projects. But I think it's important that in the mind of host governments, artisanal and small-scale mining are also integrated in this idea of local content. So in terms of employment, you're talking of a lot of people, very close linkages with local economies in terms of transportation, services, food, etc. So we often have a tendency, when we talk about local content, to restrict it to industrial projects. And as such, it constructs an imaginary of the industry being just industrial, if you see what I mean. And it's just to go a little bit against that. Thank you very much.
Hi, Laurel Green from Rio Tinto. Building on, Catherine mentioned a couple of things that I would have mentioned, so extending that commentary a little bit. I'm interested in two avenues around how do you get the balance right between sort of blunt instruments and building things into the economy, and particularly the longer term piece. Because you have to start somewhere, and certainly local content about specifications of certain industries or looking for opportunities. But how do you do two things? One is, how do you build in the aspirational context? So I know we've done work at looking for where the capacity is now and the industries that you can start up. But how do you make sure you're not selling the country short in terms of broader aspirations and making sure that builds into a better longer term prospect? So how do you know what the opportunities are going to be 5 and 10 years, and making sure that you've got the building blocks for those type of things? And I guess the other one, which is kind of a flip side, is do any of the local content policies or any of the initiatives have sunset clauses around some of them? And I guess I'm thinking around the competition pieces, is that presumably the aim of these policies is to bring up the capacity within a country to then be competitive. We've all seen, I come from Australia, there's lots of failed policies there where we've subsidised industries that were never going to be competitive, and that just sets you up for failure in the future. So just interested in any knowledge about that or any thoughts.
Okay, we had 2 questions on this side, please.
Hi, my name is Martin Bratt. I'm from McKinsey & Company. My question is to Michael. I thank you for outlining kind of 5 principles for how governments should design their local content policies. I think they're great, and I basically agree with all of them. What do you think companies can do to be better procurers and better developers of local content services and goods?
There was somebody at the end with the gentleman, so then we can try and respond and wrap up.
Howard Hallam from the World Bank. I also have a question for Michael. You mentioned the importance of including local content in the tendering process and in contracts, and Sheila mentioned the importance of education to be able to provide an environment in which local content can flourish. So my question is to Michael. What potential do you see for including relevant education, technical education, in the tendering process? I mean, there are some relevant examples, and Laurel might be able to complement what I'm about to say. Oyu Tolgoi in Mongolia, which Rio Tinto is running, I believe they have an education budget of about $140 million. They are building secondary technical schools. They are building an engineering department. They are retraining 2,500 secondary school teachers, I believe, up to Australian standards. And this is in the contract, section 8.3, I think. Yeah. And the interesting part here is I believe the reason that this was included in the contract is the Mongolians being a very small population and having a fear of having too many foreigners invading the industry. In the contract, there is an obligation of 90% Mongolian employees within 5 years, 60% Mongolian engineers within 10 years. So this kind of incentive presumably has helped in bringing Rio Tinto to providing this level of education. So my question to Michael is this viable in other contexts?
Okay, Michael, I'm gonna, am I on? I don't get it with this mic. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you. Answer all the questions you must answer.
Yes, no, yes. Okay, I'll try and be really quick. So, yes, to the last question. You can do that. Oman does that across the industry. So they'll have, in the major tenders, so over a certain threshold, $10 million, contracts over that level, the new regime across the entire oil and gas industry in Oman will ask questions on programs of investment into vocational training and tertiary education and local R&D. And that will be part of the tender evaluation. So yes, you can, and we're doing it with some other companies in some other countries.
And will they put into the contract then?
It becomes a contractual commitment. If you tell them that that's what you are intending, so you have to tell them what you're intending. The issue about what can companies, and working backwards, what companies can do, because we talked about, I'm very keen that that the operators get good line of sight of what can, can't, and could be done in the local economy vis-a-vis their forward expenditure, whether that's operations or projects, as soon as they possibly can, and they work at that quality over time. And at some point, those forecasts will end up being dropped in the lap of the major bidders, who will then take those forecasts forward and make commitments based using the same metrics and using that data. Someone mentioned rules coming in, yes, someone here, about procurement plans. Trying to get companies to put their procurement plans on the table. It always baffles me why, of course the regulators need that because then they amalgamate it together like in Brazil, and then the companies won't ever put anything on the table because they don't want to be seem to be committing. And on the partnership question, for the life of me, I can't understand why they can't talk together. And you know, if there is a project, it will probably have about 80%, have these items, and roughly the cost will be somewhere between, you know roughly where you're going. The problem is large numbers, dollar numbers, go out into the society, raises expectations. Very quickly, the Rio Tinto lady, hello. Sunset clauses, WTO, lift the lid on that one, and you've got a big legal debate, and the lawyers are going to have a field day, okay? Because nearly all countries have signed up to WTO. And most local content preferences break WTO basic principles, particularly if they're aligned with goods of domestic origin. That's the thing you have to watch. Interestingly, if it's about requirements to spend a certain proportion of dollars with nationally owned companies, that doesn't break the principle of national treatment. So it gets really interesting, the WTO question. Australia, yeah, lots of good experience in Australia. AIPPs, all those industrial plans about developing competitive supplies to go into global supply chains. I think there's a lot to be learned from Australia. So I don't have you've probably got a better answer than me to your own question. And then artisanal mining, don't know anything about that. You can do that one, okay. BG, well, I used to work for BG. So I was their local content manager for 3 years. So I know a bit about BG. Hello. To answer your questions, downstream, definitely, and the chap to answer those questions is over there. It's Tony Paul, and he is a guru on downstream LNG opportunities, so that's the chap there. Yes, navigating, I couldn't agree with you more. Helping small companies, local companies, navigate the procurement process, absolutely. And for goodness sake, anyone involved in e-procurement, can we kill it? I mean, you cannot get through the door of e-procurement if you're a local company and you have an intermittent internet signal. And when you can't fill in the box, there's no one to pick up the phone the other end. You think it's a small issue, but it's not. How can they get into a procurement process if they can't work the e-procurement system? Okay, they're my answers.
Okay, I'm going to ask Rosalind. There was a question on, first of all, what can companies do, if you want to add to that, but also what do we do about the enabling business environment? Because inherently, this is what we are dealing with. Yeah, so do you want to say something about that?
First of all, I think it's a brilliant idea. And I keep on thinking now about the list of things that I think companies can do as a non-fiscal benefit or whatever we're calling it. And that definitely is one. And again, it's a question of how you go about doing that, because it could be seen as the company interfering in the policies of a country and how it runs. But I live in a reality of it is necessary to do, and it is for the benefit of companies to do so, because in a way, it does help attract those other investors from other sectors that will cease to make the extractive industries the most dependent in countries. So I think it's a good idea, but the question again is how best to go about it. So thank you for that suggestion, actually.
So I just want to expand on that comment, and sort of I started macro, and I think I want to end on the macro level, and bringing together a couple of comments that were raised about business environment and other issues. And I think it's absolutely central that when we're talking about local content, that we realize that local content policies really are just part of a bigger ecosystem, and all these other parts have to be synced together with these local content policies in order to achieve any meaningful results. So we have to look at labor laws. We have to look at immigration. We have to look at customs. We have to look at industrial policies. We have to look at the tax system. And all of these elements have, and then of course like anti-corruption and good governance and business climate. Only if all of these, and education, right? Only if all of these aspects work together can we have a successful, successful development and fostering of local content in terms of R&D, in terms of labor and local hiring, local procurement, and so on. So it's really this ecosystem that it takes, because otherwise we always see a schizophrenic debate. I mean, it's so revealing when you go to these countries and you talk about local content, and it takes me back to Michael's definition, right? Because I had a good conversation with a gentleman who owns a very big construction company in Saudi Arabia, and he was totally in favor of local content, and he was so upset that this building was built by a Korean company and that building was built by whatever. So on that side, totally in favor of local content. But when it came to hiring, no, of course, how can you possibly expect me to hire Saudis when they have salary expectations that are so much higher than Filipinos, and they want to have, vacation, and they want to have, they think that after 8 hours of work, they want to quit. So depending on who you talk to, they have like very different ideas about what sort of local content they personally like, right? And in order to have a comprehensive policy, we have to make all these elements work together and point in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question that Catherine asked about a natural resource-based local content policy versus a national local content policy. I guess the answer is, Catherine, is that's why I see it as an industrial development policy. Yeah, and the local content is a stream of it. Frankly, an electrician on a mine is an electrician on a construction site, in the factory. And so if you understand that if you develop skills around those technical skills that cut across industry, then that is likely to increase your competitiveness in attracting manufacturers, and therefore you might not need to legislate because you've already created a groundswell of capability. The question on the long-term aspirational and where the tipping point is, are there certain things that a country cannot reasonably do competitively and therefore must outsource? I think it's a very important one. And as a matter of fact, I think when we think about the blueprint that Michael was espousing, part of what we should do is know, in the big scheme of things and as far as we can see, what are the things that we will be better off outsourcing in perpetuity, such as it is. And I think this is important. The assumption that a country can and will always do everything for itself is flawed. The world just isn't constructed like that. We trade with each other. So it stands to reason then that we must assume that we can't localize everything. So again, I agree with you that there has to be some kind of sobriety brought to bear when we develop these visions. So in conclusion then, I think this was very interesting. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank everybody for their participation. I think this is an interesting subject. These companies are multinationals because they are multinationals. And here we are wanting to localize them. They've spent 50 years wanting to create the advantage of sourcing where it's competitive. So there's a certain counterintuitiveness inherent in this. But if they legislate, guess what? We will do our best to comply. Good night, everyone.